Thank you so much. That's a very nice welcome. Have you ever wondered why God is a bloke? That's the title of my piece today. And I discovered there's not a lot of detail about what God is, except that he made men to look just like him in his own image. But the Bible does tell us that he's capricious, he's cruel, vengeful, and filled with hatred for those who don't worship him. That is also for blacks, Jews, gays, and women. And monotheism means you can't shop around for a nicer personality. If the ancient Greeks weren't keen on Zeus, who was in charge of the weather, then they could go for his daughter Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, wilderness and childbirth, or her handsome twin brother Apollo. He was god of music, healing, poetry, archery, and associated with light, truth, and the sun. Hestia was another virgin, but keen on cooking, home and hearth. Hera, queen of heaven and goddess of marriage and childbirth, was beautiful. She wore a crown and held a lotus-tipped staff. They procreated with one another and with humans, creating hundreds of demigods and deities in every imaginable portfolio. Plays and poetry were written about their interaction, and they were heaps of fun. Now, as a child, I was told how totally good and loving and caring the Christian God was, which is exactly what is said today to 5-year-olds in our secular state schools who are unlucky enough to have a chaplain or to sit through religious tuition. Now, no doubt they try and make those lessons fun, but there's not a lot to work with. What I can be certain of is that they won't be told that women must not have authority over men and that they must be silent because, unlike the animal world, Adam was formed first, then Eve, from one of his ribs. You know the story. Even in the 21st century, even school children would be at least puzzled by both of those propositions. However, the churches have very subtle ways of getting the idea across. Shine is a program devised by Hillsong Church and is being used by chaplains in state schools here. It targets girls with low self-esteem, giving them advice about being polite, personal grooming and deportment, and the message to them is that they must conform and be pretty. At Sunday school, I was steered away from the more unpalatable passages of the Bible, like the one in which Eve was punished severely for hers and Adam's sin in eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge when it was forbidden by God. Early religion obviously valued ignorance as a virtue for women, as do the Taliban today, and the boards of corporations populated by only men. Adam was exonerated because Eve had led him astray, of course, a plea successfully used by men charged with rape until quite recently. Eve's sorrow would be greatly multiplied in childbearing, which was taken by theologians to mean variously that women should expect great pain in childbirth and endure it without complaint. So women braced themselves and the prophecy became self-fulfilling. Others thought they should scream out loud because this would please God. And in the 19th century, when painkillers were available, it was declared sinful for birthing women to use them. Now, the Catholics largely took the curse on Eve to mean that sex in marriage was a necessary evil and should only be used for the purpose of procreation. It follows, therefore, that there's no need for contraception. Now, thanks to this marvellous doctrine, mostly ignored by those with money and education, 250 million couples around the world in poor countries have no access to condoms or anything else to limit the number of children they bear. The women of East Timor on our doorstep have on average 8 children which they can neither feed nor educate adequately. Apparently, this is what God wants. It also follows that priests who have no fathering role will not need sex and can be trusted to not sexually abuse children in their care. The Bible is contemptuous of women's bodies and natural functions. Leviticus says, and I quote, "A woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. The woman must wait 35 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. If she gives birth to a daughter, for 2 weeks the woman will be unclean as during her period, and so on. The Bible uses words like whore to describe women who offended against the double standard that applied to sexual behaviour, and women could be put to death for being unfaithful or even being raped. Honour killings still happen in some countries. Women are still accused of asking for it. Girls who are sexually autonomous today run the risk of being labelled a slut too. Until recently there was an unwritten rule in film plots that a woman actively engaged in sex outside marriage would have to be repatriated or tragically killed off before the end. And of course that didn't apply to men. Thanks to cameras on mobile phones, women may find photographs of their naked bodies being emailed to men unknown to them. Footballers get away with abusing and denigrating young women because of their importance on the field. According to the Bible, women may not divorce their husbands, but husbands can dissolve a marriage and take the children and the assets. The Gospel, according to Matthew, says men will be made immortal for forsaking, that is leaving, their wife and children for Jesus' sake. Now, it took a very long time for most civilised countries to more fairly treat women in family matters, and gains won by women in family law are very often lost, as was the case in Australia with so-called shared parenting recently. Men who do not allow themselves to be defiled by having sex with women will be saved as a special offering to God. The Bible is, of course, full of such dangerous nonsense, all written by self-appointed men of God who were certainly ignorant by today's standards, probably representative of a very patriarchal, tribal, violent and intolerant society. Now, we don't need to cite today all of the anti-woman parts of the Bible or to cover the 2,000 years of persecution, witch-burning and general denigration of women by the Abrahamic religions. But I do find it puzzling that in the 21st century, adherents to the word of a God they believe in can so easily ignore this history, particularly women. There is, of course, a large population of theologians who devise complex arguments and language to confuse and explain away that which is absurd and should outrage women today. I prefer to leave religion to the religious, but with fewer than 10% of the population going to church on a regular basis, religion still has great influence and power over women's lives. Indeed, it is arguable that this influence has grown since the 1960s in particular. Consider this speech by John F. Kennedy 50 years ago as President of the United States. I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from that of the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. Now, I think for the Aussies in the audience, and I think you're mostly that, we will agree that we will die waiting for such a spirited defence of the separation of church and state from our current political leaders. John Howard's co-opted God for his own political advantage. He insisted that Australian values all stemmed from Christian heritage, and he endorsed the ratbag churches like the Ministries of Fire and Exclusive Brethren. He did not say that sending troops to Iraq was encouraged by his God, but God-fearing George W. Bush must have told him this was where his own writing instructions came from. So Barack Obama's mention of people of no belief in his inauguration speech recently made me gasp. Thank you, Mr. Obama. I hate the words politically correct, but when it comes to religion, I think this is what we've become. The debate concerning women and the church tends to be limited to the ordination of women, which of course has its roots in the biblical insistence that women remain silent in church. Yet a century ago, prominent women openly challenged man-made religion. American suffragette and prolific writer and outspoken feminist who died over a century ago, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said, "The Bible teaches that women brought sin and death into the world, that she precipitated the fall of the race, that she was arraigned before the judgment seat of heaven, tried, condemned and sentenced. Marriage for her was to be a condition of bondage, maternity a period of suffering and anguish, and in silence and subjection. She was to play the role of a dependent on man's bounty for all her material wants and for all the information she might desire. I know of no other book that so fully teaches the subjection and degradation of women." Now, she was someone who was a believer, as most of the population were in the 19th century, but she set about writing a Bible for women. She said, "When women understand that governments and religion are human interventions, that Bibles, prayer books, catechisms and encyclical letters are all emanations from the brain of man, they will no longer be oppressed by the injunctions that come to them with the divine authority of 'Thus saith the Lord.'" I like to think that if Rosemary Cady Stanton was alive today, she'd have given up on God altogether, as well as the male construct that claims to be his word. Religion may be irrelevant to most Australians, but its legacy lives on, and until we challenge out loud the moral authority the Church insists that it has, women will never be considered to be fully human. I'll finish with a quote from Simone de Beauvoir from The Second Sex, written in 1949. "Man enjoys the great advantage of having a God endorse the code he writes, and since man exercises a sovereign authority over women, it is especially fortunate that this authority has been vested in him by the Supreme Being. For the Jews, Mohammedans, Christians amongst others, man is master by divine right. The threat of God will therefore repress any impulse towards a revolt in the downtrodden female." It's little wonder, I think, that God was a bloke.